A black woman walks into the clutching her chest. Gasping for air, she pleads for help, but the doctor barely glances at her before dismissing her symptoms as anxiety. 7 minutes later, alarms are blaring, and the woman is in critical condition. But what happens next changes everything. The doctor is removed from duty on the spot, and a hidden truth about how patients are treated comes to light, exposing a system no one was ready to face. Stay with me, this is a story that will leave you questioning everything. Before we begin, comment below where you're watching from and let us know if stories like this matter to you. Don't forget to subscribe for more real stories that need to be told. Lila Freeman stepped into the cold embrace of the emergency room, the weight of the evening pressing harder against her chest than the December air outside. The glass doors of Greenridge Medical slid open with a sterile hush. But the fluorescent lights inside felt harsher, like they weren't just illuminating the room but exposing something deeper. Something she had learned to ignore in polite company. She wasn't the only one who noticed the way eyes glanced at her. Then away. It wasn't overt. It rarely was. It was in the way the receptionist's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. In the split-second hesitation before Nurse Eva Ramirez rushed forward with a wheelchair. "You all right, ma'am?" Eva's voice was soft, steady. She knelt beside Lila as if she were trying to shield her from something neither of them could name aloud. Lila tried to speak, but the words dissolved as another wave of pain bloomed across her chest. "Let's get you inside," Eva said, helping her into the wheelchair. The emergency room hummed with life. A toddler's wail echoed from the corner. A man in paint-streaked coveralls clutched his bandaged hand, whispering into his phone, but none of them made Eva nervous. It was the way Lila pressed one hand tightly to her ribs. The gray sheen across her skin, those were the quiet alarms ringing in Eva's head. As they moved down the corridor, Lila's pulse throbbed visibly at the base of her neck. The air smelled of antiseptic, but it did little to mask the sense of waiting that hung in the room. Patients waiting for care. Staff waiting for the end of their shift. Lila could feel it too, lingering in her breath like an unwelcome guest. Eva eased her onto the examination bed and tucked a blanket over her legs. "I'll get Dr. Reynolds to take a look." "Thank you," Lila managed. Her voice felt far away, as if it were someone else's floating in the space between them. But Eva lingered. There was something unsettling about leaving Lila alone. Something familiar about the way Lila's eyes flickered between confidence and doubt. "I'll be fine," Lila said, as if reading Eva's hesitation. Eva nodded, but she remembered the last time she heard those words from a patient who never made it out of the hospital. Dr. David Reynolds stepped into the room 5 minutes later. He was brisk, polished. His white coat caught the light like armor. His shoes so clean they reflected the overhead bulbs. But his gaze barely touched Lila as he read her chart. "Chest pain?" Reynolds asked, not looking up. "Yes," Lila tried to explain, but her breath caught. "Anxiety, most likely," Reynolds interrupted, scribbling something onto the clipboard. Lila opened her mouth to argue, but he was already turning toward the door. "Take some aspirin. Follow up with your primary care." That was all. As the door clicked shut behind him, Lila stared at the empty space where Reynolds had stood. She wasn't sure what felt heavier, the ache spreading under her ribs or the weight of being dismissed. Wrapped in such practiced indifference that it almost felt reasonable. But Eva saw it. From the corner of the room, she watched the brief exchange, her knuckles tightening around the clipboard. Lila wasn't like the others. Lila wore a tailored coat, the kind that spoke of corner offices and respectable addresses. But even that wasn't enough. Eva thought about the older man last week, white, mid-50s, with the same complaint. Reynolds hadn't left his side. He was on the phone with cardiology before the man even took his shoes off. And now? Now Eva stood there, wondering how many times she had let this happen. Outside the room, Reynolds moved down the hall with the calm of someone who had done this 1,000 times. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't hostile. But that was the thing about men like him. They didn't need to be. Eva caught up with him near the nurse's station. "Dr. Reynolds," she began, keeping her voice measured. He turned, brow lifting slightly. "I think Ms. Freeman's symptoms might be more serious," she said carefully. Reynolds' smile was small but sharp at the edges. "Eva, I've been doing this for years. You can't let every anxious patient send up alarms." Eva nodded, but her stomach twisted. She wanted to say something else. Wanted to remind him that Lila's blood pressure was too high. That the color in her face had drained completely. That every second they wasted might cost more than they realized. But she didn't. Instead, Eva watched him walk away. Lila's hands trembled as she tried to steady her breathing. She thought about calling someone. Her sister. Maybe. But the weight of admitting she was scared felt too heavy to lift. She knew the look Reynolds had given her. She'd seen it in boardrooms. At business lunches. You're fine. Stop imagining things. But Lila wasn't fine, and something told her that the night was far from over. As the clock crept toward midnight, Nurse Eva Ramirez stood outside Lila's door, waiting, because if there was one thing she had learned after 15 years in the it was this. Sometimes saving a life meant being the only one who refused to look away. Lila Freeman sat alone in the quiet hum of the examination room. The thin paper beneath her crackled each time she shifted. A reminder of how small she felt beneath the weight of fluorescent light. She crossed her arms over her chest, pressing against the ache that had settled there like an unwelcome house guest. Through the small window in the door, she watched the rhythm of the emergency room unfold. Nurses glided past with calm urgency. The occasional burst of laughter drifting in from the hallway, a strange juxtaposition to the pounding of her own heart. She told herself this was just routine. She wasn't dying. Dr. Reynolds said so, didn't he? But that doubt, that splinter in the back of her mind, kept twisting deeper. Eva Ramirez returned, pushing the door open with her hip. The nurse's face held a practiced calm. But there was something else there too. A flicker of frustration. Lila recognized it. It was the same flicker she'd seen in her own reflection over the years, the restrained exasperation of someone who knew exactly what had just happened but didn't have the luxury of calling it by name. Would you like some water? Eva asked softly. Lila shook her head. No, thank you. Eva hesitated. Ms. Freeman, how long have you been feeling like this? Lila glanced down at her hands, which rested uneasily in her lap. Since this morning. I thought it was just stress. Eva's eyes softened, but Lila caught how the nurse's fingers gripped the edge of the clipboard. White at the knuckles. Did Dr. Reynolds check everything? Lila hesitated. She didn't want to be the difficult patient. The complainer. He said it's anxiety. I suppose he knows better than I do. A quiet stretched between them, one that neither woman seemed to know how to cross. In the hallway, Eva leaned against the cool wall, closing her eyes for a moment. The gnawing feeling in her chest wouldn't let up. She thought about the businessman last week, the one Reynolds personally escorted to cardiology. He hadn't looked half as bad as Lila. Eva wasn't a doctor, but 15 years in this hospital had taught her to trust the signs patients couldn't hide. The subtle gray around the lips. The fragile tremble in their hands. The shadow of something deeper than nerves. But it wasn't just the symptoms she saw. It was the familiar dance around them, the way certain patients like Lila, were asked to prove they were hurting. Eva remembered her mother's voice. Stern and unflinching. Don't let them make you invisible. Eva, they'll did if you let them. Her gaze shifted to the nurse's station, where Dr. Reynolds stood, flipping through charts without urgency. Doctor, Eva said, her voice steady as she approached him. Reynolds barely looked up. Yes? I think we should run an EKG for Ms. Freeman. He finally met her eyes. But there was a coolness there. The kind that often came from men who thought experience was armor. Eva, we're packed tonight. If I ran tests for every chest pain that walked through the door, we'd have a line out to the street. But her pressure's high, and she's pale. He cut her off with a soft sigh, as if she were a child tugging on his sleeve. You're a good nurse, but anxiety looks like this all the time. Let it go. Eva swallowed the heat rising in her throat. She glanced past him to the next patient being wheeled in, an older white man clutching his arm. Groaning loudly, Reynolds was already moving toward him, brows furrowed in concern. It was a familiar script. Lila shifted restlessly, glancing at the clock. Nearly 20 minutes had passed since Reynolds left the room. She thought about calling for someone, but the doubt crept in again. She didn't want to be seen as fragile. She'd learned, like so many others, how to wear strength like armor, how to walk into rooms and command attention without ever making people uncomfortable. But discomfort had a way of finding her anyway. The door opened, and this time, Eva entered with quiet resolve. Ms. Freeman, she said, closing the door behind her. I'm going to check your vitals again. Lila nodded, exhaling softly. I appreciate it. As Eva wrapped the blood pressure cuff around Lila's arm, she spoke in a hushed voice. Listen, I'm not supposed to say this, but sometimes they get it wrong. Lila's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Eva hesitated for a breath, choosing her words carefully. What I mean is if something doesn't feel right, you push. No one knows your body better than you. Lila's eyes softened in recognition. I'll stay close, Eva added. Lila's hand rested lightly over Eva's. It was a simple touch, but it spoke louder than either of them could. Down the hall, Dr. June Harper, chief of emergency medicine, tapped her pen against the desk as she scanned patient charts. Eva approached, her face composed but tense. Dr. Harper, she began, sliding Lila's chart toward her. Could you take a look at this? Harper glanced up. There was a quiet respect between them, forged through years of long shifts and hard nights. What are you seeing? Harper asked, already flipping through the notes. She's showing signs of cardiac distress. But Dr. Reynolds. Harper's eyes flicked toward room 7. Understanding immediately. I'll check on her, Harper said, rising from her chair. Eva exhaled slowly. Some battles weren't won with raised voices or grand gestures. Sometimes they were won in quiet hallways, with clipped words and lingering stares. But as Harper moved toward Lila's room, Eva couldn't help but wonder how many patients had slipped through the cracks before tonight. How many had gone home carrying doubt like a stone, only to find out too late that the ache in their chest wasn't just imagined. And as the minutes ticked by, Eva knew this wasn't just about Lila. It was about the next patient, and the one after that. It was about who got to be believed. Lila Freeman stared at the ceiling tiles, counting each one as if they might hold the answer to the dull, steady ache behind her ribs. The room felt colder now, the sterile hum of the fluorescent lights pressing down like an unwelcome weight. She shifted, trying to ignore the faint beeping of the monitor beside her. The thin sheet across her lap did little to warm her, but she told herself this was nothing. People didn't die from being ignored. Or maybe they did. Lila glanced at the clock. 7 minutes had passed since Dr. Reynolds left. The silence of those minutes grew louder with each breath. Eva Ramirez wasn't standing still anymore. She paced outside room 7, the same clipboard in her hand that Reynolds had brushed off not long ago. Her heart pounded in her chest, not from panic, but from the certainty of knowing when something was wrong and feeling powerless to stop it. This wasn't just about Lila. Eva thought of the others, the patients who had come through this hospital and walked away with nothing but a vague prescription and a pat on the shoulder. Some of them didn't make it back for a second opinion. She saw their names in the files. She heard their stories whispered in the break room. Eva didn't need to see a report to know that most of those patients looked more like Lila than the man Reynolds was with now. Hey, a voice broke through her thoughts. Dr. June Harper stood at the nurse's station, her dark eyes sharp beneath furrowed brows. Did Reynolds check on her again? Eva shook her head. No, he said it was anxiety. Harper's jaw tightened, but her face didn't change. Let's take another look. Lila closed her eyes. She thought about the first time she felt this small back in college, when a professor read over her essay without ever meeting her gaze. As if the words she had written were less important because of the skin she wore. It had been the same in meetings at work, where promotions were whispered over cocktails she wasn't invited to. The weight of it followed her. Even here, even now, in the simple act of being believed. She wondered if Reynolds knew he had sent her home before he even asked her name. The door opened softly, and Lila blinked up at Eva, whose face held that same flicker of concern. Dr. Harper's going to run a few tests, Eva said, just to be sure. Lila's chest eased a little. Not from the pain but from the knowledge that someone had listened. Down the hall, Reynolds leaned against the counter, his eyes scanning the monitor in room 3. The older man with chest pain was already prepped for an EKG. Reynolds was speaking with the cardiologist over the phone, his voice calm, professional. Eva watched him from a distance, the muscles in her shoulders tight. It wasn't that Reynolds was a bad doctor. He saved lives. But there was something quieter beneath it, the way his judgment bent and shifted depending on who lay in front of him. Eva had seen it before. She remembered watching her own father walk into hospitals with back pain after years of laboring in factories. The doctors had smiled at him, nodded, and sent him home with nothing but painkillers. It wasn't until his heart gave out on a Saturday morning that anyone realized the ache in his back had been a sign of something deeper. Something more dangerous. Eva swallowed the lump rising in her throat. She wouldn't let that happen to Lila. In room 7, Harper pressed the cold metal of the stethoscope against Lila's chest. "Breathe in," Harper said, "and out." Lila followed the instructions carefully. Though the tightness lingered, Harper glanced at the vitals. Her lips tightening. The numbers didn't lie. "How long have you been feeling this?" Harper asked. "Since this morning," Lila said quietly. "But it wasn't as bad until tonight." Harper nodded. She didn't need to ask more. The signs were already there: the faint sheen of sweat, the shallow breaths, the gray tint beneath Lila's skin. Harper had seen this before. She stepped back, stripping off her gloves. "We're running an EKG. Right now." Lila blinked. "I thought." Harper's gaze softened, but there was steel beneath it. "You were right to trust yourself." Eva wheeled the EKG machine into the room as Harper prepped the leads. Outside the door, Reynolds walked past. He slowed for a brief second, peering inside, his eyes flicking to the machine. "Doctor?" Eva called out. Reynolds stepped in, a faint crease between his brows. "I already examined Miss Freeman," he said. His voice was careful, but there was an edge beneath it, one Eva had heard too many times. Harper straightened. "We're running it again." Reynolds glanced at the monitor. "Her symptoms are consistent with anxiety. And they're also consistent with a heart attack," Harper replied, not missing a beat. The two doctors locked eyes for a moment that stretched too long. Lila lay still, the leads cool against her skin as the machine began to hum. The line between certainty and doubt narrowed to the thin slip of paper sliding out of the EKG. Eva watched the first spike, then the next. The room shifted. Harper's lips thinned as she snatched the paper. Scanning the readings. "Call cardiology," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Now." Reynolds stepped forward, his mouth opening to argue. But Harper held up the EKG strip. "The line's unmistakable. She's in the early stages of a heart attack," Harper said quietly, letting the words settle in the space between them. The weight of it hung there, pressing on Reynolds in a way that couldn't be brushed aside. Eva didn't miss the way his shoulders stiffened, or how he quickly stepped out of the room, phone in hand. Lila closed her eyes as Harper squeezed her hand gently. The minutes that had stretched so long before were moving faster now. 7 minutes. Sometimes that was all it took to hold the weight of a life. The emergency room carried on, oblivious to the quiet battle unfolding in room 7. Lila Freeman lay still, eyes half-lidded as the throb in her chest ebbed and flowed like a tide. The EKG wires still clung to her skin, cold and unfeeling, but their sharp printout whispered truths that could no longer be dismissed. Dr. Harper had stepped out, leaving Eva Ramirez to hover by Lila's side. Lila could feel Eva's presence, a small, steady beacon in the sterile hush of the room. "I suppose I should be grateful," Lila murmured, her voice thin. Eva glanced up. "For what?" "That someone believed me," Lila replied. She shifted her weight carefully, grimacing as the dull ache flared beneath her ribs. "But it shouldn't take this much effort to be heard." Eva lowered her eyes, not because she disagreed but because she understood too well. "Some people walk through this door, and they're believed the moment they speak," Eva said softly. "Others have to bleed before anyone listens." Lila's gaze drifted toward the door, as if expecting Reynolds to return. But the hall outside remained empty, save for the faint shuffle of feet and the distant echo of laughter from the nurse's station. It was strange, Lila thought, how the most dangerous thing she faced wasn't the heart attack brewing beneath her skin but the long shadow of disbelief that had nearly let it grow unchecked. Dr. Harper leaned against the counter outside room 7, EKG strip still clutched between her fingers. Down the hall, Reynolds stood by the vending machine, phone pressed to his ear. His posture was rigid, but Harper recognized the familiar shape of guilt settling in his shoulders, the quiet weight of being wrong. But guilt was an indulgence that came too late. Harper knew men like Reynolds. He wasn't malicious. He wasn't the villain that stories needed. But that was precisely the problem. The face of injustice often wore no scowl, carried no whip. It moved through polite conversations, shook hands at luncheons, and smiled reassuringly as it told you nothing was wrong. Eva approached as Harper tucked the EKG strip into the patient chart. "Cardiology's on standby," Eva said. careful to keep her voice low. Harper nodded. Good. Eva hesitated, eyes flicking toward Reynolds at the vending machine. Dr. Harper. Harper met her gaze, and for a moment, Eva hesitated, but the words spilled out anyway. It's not just tonight. Harper's expression hardened. She had suspected as much. But hearing it aloud anchored the thought into something heavier. How many patients? Harper asked. Eva exhaled slowly. Enough. She didn't need to elaborate. Harper knew what enough meant. The air in room 7 felt thicker now, pressing down with an unseen weight. Lila's hand rested against her chest, feeling the faint flutter beneath her palm. The pain had eased slightly with the nitroglycerin Eva had given her, but it lingered like an unwelcome guest who refused to leave. She stared at the ceiling, counting the seconds. 7 minutes to be dismissed. 10 more before Harper ordered the EKG. A lifetime of knowing this wasn't new. Lila thought back to the countless boardrooms. The polite dismissals wrapped in silk-tongued professionalism. The projects she'd led only to watch others claim the credit. The way her voice always had to rise just a little higher to be noticed. It wasn't the heart attack that scared her. It was the possibility that tonight might have ended quietly. That her name might have been another footnote in some file. Her face one more photograph framed by polite condolences at a funeral service no one would question. Harper returned a few minutes later. Eva at her side. We're moving you upstairs, Harper said. Lila looked at her, studying the lines etched into the older woman's face. There was a certainty in her gaze that Lila clung to like a rope. You mean Reynolds changed his mind? Lila asked, raising a brow. Harper's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. He doesn't need to agree, Harper said plainly. Eva smothered a laugh under her breath as she reached for Lila's chart. Lila pressed her hand lightly against Eva's. Thank you. Eva met her gaze, and in that quiet exchange, something unspoken passed between them, something shared by those who knew what it meant to stand in the forgotten spaces between belief and dismissal. Reynolds was gone by the time they wheeled Lila upstairs. Lila wasn't surprised. Men like him often slipped away quietly when things grew uncomfortable. As the elevator doors closed, Lila exhaled softly. But Eva? Eva stayed. She rode the elevator to the cardiac floor, her hands steady on the rail as if anchoring herself to the weight of everything left unsaid. Lila didn't know what would happen after tonight, whether Reynolds would face consequences, whether things would change, but she knew that when she had been made invisible, it was Eva who refused to look away. And sometimes, that was enough to tilt the scale, even if only for a night. The quiet hum of the cardiac ward felt different from the emergency room, thicker somehow, as if the air itself carried the weight of the lives that passed through it. Lila Freeman could feel it pressing down as she lay in the hospital bed, one hand resting lightly on the pulse at her wrist. The ache in her chest had dulled, but the memory of it lingered. Outside her window, the city glowed with the faint hush of early evening. A soft rain had started, tapping against the glass like a quiet reminder that life outside moved on. Indifferent to the battles fought behind hospital walls, Eva Ramirez stood by the doorway, flipping through Lila's chart, but her eyes weren't on the paper. They were on the hallway watching. Lila noticed. He's not coming back, Lila said softly, following Eva's gaze. Eva's lips tightened into something between frustration and resignation. I know. It wasn't disappointment. Neither of them had expected Reynolds to return. But his absence hung over them, silent and absolute. You ever wonder, Lila began, her voice drifting, if they even notice the weight they leave behind? Eva didn't answer right away. She stepped closer to the bed, lowering the chart to her side. They notice, Eva said eventually, but it's easier to leave it for someone else to carry. Lila nodded. She had lived long enough to recognize the quiet calculus of men like Reynolds. It wasn't hatred that drove them. Hatred required effort. No, this was something softer, indifference polished smooth by years of unchallenged authority. I shouldn't be surprised, Lila said. Eva glanced at her. Why not? Because this isn't the first time, Lila replied, and I doubt it'll be the last. There was no bitterness in her voice, just fact. Eva didn't press. She had learned long ago that people carried their own archives of unspoken history. Some things didn't need to be explained, not when they were written so clearly in the lines of a woman's face. But something shifted in the room, a recognition that stretched between them, bridging the quiet divide of nurse and patient. An hour passed, marked by the slow drip of the IV and the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. Lila drifted in and out of light sleep. But even as her body rested, her mind stayed awake, turning over the events of the day like worn stones in her hand. She remembered Reynolds' face as he dismissed her, the casual flick of his pen across the chart, the way he had looked past her, through her. It wasn't just him. It was every doctor, every teacher, every manager who had decided consciously or not that her pain mattered less. "You're fine. It's just stress. Take a day off. You'll be all right." And sometimes, if she spoke up too loudly, there was the soft but pointed reminder, "Don't make this about race." But it was always about race. Even when it wasn't. Dr. June Harper entered the room with the quiet authority of someone who had spent years carving space for herself in places where she wasn't always welcome. Her eyes met Lila's immediately. "How are you feeling?" Harper asked. Lila considered the question, breathing easier. Harper nodded, folding her arms. "Good, we caught it in time." Eva lingered by the window, but Harper motioned for her to stay. "I spoke with cardiology," Harper continued. "You'll need to stay overnight for observation. But you're stable. That's the important thing." Lila watched Harper carefully, the subtle tension in her jaw, the weight behind her words. There was more she wasn't saying. "And Reynolds?" Lila asked. Harper's gaze didn't waver. "He's gone for the night." "Of course he is," Lila said, almost to herself. The room settled into a stillness that neither Harper nor Eva seemed eager to break. But then Harper stepped closer to the bed, lowering her voice. "He's not the only one," Harper said. "Doctors like him there are more than I care to admit. They don't always mean harm, but they leave enough of it behind." Lila's eyes didn't leave Harper's face. "And no one stops them," Lila said plainly. Harper's lips pressed together, but she didn't deny it. "It's not that simple," Harper replied. Lila smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "It never is." Later that evening, Eva returned to Lila's room, this time without the clipboard. She carried a small plastic cup of water, setting it on the tray beside the bed. Lila sat up slightly, meeting Eva's eyes. "Did you know?" Lila asked quietly. "Did you know something was wrong before Reynolds left the room?" Eva didn't look away. "Yes." Lila nodded slowly. "But you didn't say anything." Eva's hands tightened at her sides. "I tried. He wouldn't listen." The weight of those words hung between them. But Lila's gaze softened. "I'm not blaming you," Lila said gently. "I know what it's like to sit in rooms where no one listens." Eva's eyes lowered, as if she were ashamed of how familiar those words felt. "Sometimes," Eva whispered, "I wonder if speaking up even changes anything." Lila's expression grew thoughtful. "Maybe not," Lila said, "but silence never does." Eva exhaled softly, as if she had been holding that breath all day. And for the first time, Lila allowed herself to close her eyes fully, trusting just for a moment that someone was still standing watch. The hospital at night was a different place. The rush of the day quieted to something more intimate, more exposed. The hum of machines replaced the chatter of doctors, and footsteps echoed just a little louder against the tile floors. Lila Freeman lay awake in room 214, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds that filled the spaces between breaths. Somewhere down the hall, someone coughed a dry, hollow sound. Nurses' shoes tapped softly as they passed, and the occasional crackle of a voice over the intercom reminded her that this place never really slept. Neither did she. The ache in her chest had faded beneath the medication, but the weight of the night remained. Lila had seen men like Dr. Reynolds before. She had worked alongside them, sat across from them in boardrooms where her voice always needed to be twice as firm, twice as measured. Their doubt didn't come in shouts or accusations. It came quietly, wrapped in courtesy. "Are you sure you're understanding this correctly?" they would ask. And always, the underlying question lingered unspoken. "How do you know what you feel?" Even now, with her heart wrapped in wires and monitors, Lila could hear that same question in Reynolds' absence. Eva Ramirez sat at the nurse's station, tapping her pen lightly against the edge of her clipboard. The night shift dragged in a way the day never did, stretching seconds into something thicker, heavier. Her eyes flicked to room 214 more often than necessary. The faint blue light from Lila's monitor pulsed steadily, but Eva wasn't looking at the numbers. She was thinking about the hesitation she had felt earlier, the way her voice had faltered beneath Reynolds' gaze. She hated that part of herself, the part that measured the weight of her words before speaking. In the quiet of the night, it was harder to ignore. Lila's eyes drifted toward the window. Rain streaked the glass, distorting the city lights into long, shimmering trails. She thought of her grandmother's house, how the rain sounded against the tin roof in the summers of her youth. When the world still felt manageable and small, she remembered those afternoons, sitting on the porch while her grandmother snapped peas from the vine. Their rhythm in sync with the rain. "The world's gonna try to tell you who you are," her grandmother had said once, not looking up from her work. "But don't let them decide what you know." That memory felt closer now than it had in years. Lila shifted in bed, wincing slightly. She glanced toward the door, half expecting Dr. Harper or Eva to return. But the hallway beyond was empty. Instead, she listened to the sound of muffled voices from the room next door. In room 215, a man's voice carried through the thin hospital walls. His words were low, but something in the tone sharp and impatient made Lila sit up just a little straighter. "You're exaggerating," the man said. His words clipped. "It's probably nothing. Let's wait until morning." Lila's hand gripped the edge of the sheet. She had heard that voice before, not the man's. But the voice he wore. It was the voice of certainty. The kind of certainty that dismissed the pain of others as if it were an inconvenience. A woman's voice responded, softer, tinged with exhaustion. "I know what I feel," the woman said, almost pleading. Lila closed her eyes. Eva noticed Lila's door cracked open when she passed by on her late rounds. She hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. Lila turned toward her, eyes clear despite the hour. "Someone next door," Lila said quietly. "She's being dismissed." Eva's gaze flicked to the wall, as if she could see through it. Lila's voice lowered, but it held an edge now. "It sounds familiar." Eva lingered by the bed, unsure whether to respond. She knew what Lila was really saying. It wasn't just about the woman next door. It was about all of them, the patients whose pain was treated like an exaggeration, whose bodies had to work harder just to prove they were breaking. Eva exhaled softly. "I'll check on her," Eva said. Lila met her eyes and nodded once. Eva slipped into room 215 with the ease of someone used to navigating uneasy spaces. A young black woman sat upright in bed, her face pale and drawn. The man standing at the foot of the bed wore a sharp suit, but his arms were crossed, his posture stiff with impatience. Eva glanced at the chart. "Kara Mitchell, 34. Ms. Mitchell," Eva said gently, stepping closer. "How are you feeling?" Kara's eyes flicked toward the man as if seeking permission to answer. "She's fine," the man interrupted. "She's just anxious. It happens sometimes." Eva didn't look at him. Her focus stayed on Kara. Waiting. After a moment, Kara spoke, her voice thin. "It's not anxiety," Kara whispered. "My chest feels tight, like there's something pressing down." Eva nodded slowly. Writing in the chart. "We're going to run an EKG," Eva said, keeping her tone even. The man frowned. "Is that really necessary?" Eva's eyes lifted to meet his for the first time. "Yes," she said firmly. "It is." Lila was still awake when Eva returned 20 minutes later. "She's stable," Eva said, lowering herself into the chair beside Lila's bed. Lila didn't respond right away. She watched Eva carefully, seeing the exhaustion in her shoulders, the weight she carried quietly. "Did she ask you to?" Lila asked softly. Eva frowned. "Ask me what?" If it was all in her head. Eva hesitated. "Yes," she admitted. Lila leaned back against the pillows, exhaling slowly. "You said something anyway," Lila said, more statement than question. Eva nodded. "This time, I did." Lila's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "Good." Morning came slowly to the hospital, the pale light of dawn creeping across the linoleum floors as if uncertain it belonged there. Lila Freeman lay awake, watching the first streaks of sun break across the windowpane. Sleep had been fitful, drifting in and out like the tide. Outside her room, the world stirred, nurses changing shifts, carts rolling down the hall, murmured conversations lingering just beyond reach. But in here, the stillness remained, pressing down like an unfinished thought. Lila wasn't alone. Eva Ramirez sat in the corner, legs crossed beneath her, a clipboard resting loosely in her lap. She wasn't writing, she wasn't reading, she was just there, her presence anchoring the silence. It felt deliberate. "You didn't have to stay," Lila said softly. Eva glanced up, offering a small, tired smile. I know. Lila shifted against the pillows, wincing slightly as a dull ache flared beneath her ribs. How's the woman next door? Lila asked, though she already knew the answer. She'll be all right, Eva replied. Her EKG showed signs of early heart distress. We caught it in time. Lila's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. But they weren't going to catch it, she said, not until someone stayed long enough to listen. Eva didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. Dr. Harper arrived just as the sun fully crested over the horizon. She stepped into the room with the ease of someone used to navigating difficult spaces. But the weight of the night still lingered in her eyes. How are you feeling? Harper asked, checking the monitor as she spoke. Better, Lila replied. Harper nodded, scribbling something in the chart. But there was a pause, brief but heavy, as she met Lila's gaze. You were right to speak up, Harper said. Lila studied her for a long moment. I shouldn't have had to. Harper's pen stopped mid-stroke. No, Harper agreed quietly. You shouldn't have. Lila sat up a little straighter, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. I've been thinking, Lila began, her voice measured, about all the people who didn't speak up, or the ones who did but weren't heard. Harper's expression didn't shift, but something flickered behind her eyes, a recognition. Sharp and quiet. It happens more than you think, Harper said, lowering the chart to her side. People dismissed, patients overlooked. Sometimes it's unconscious. Other times, she let the words trail off. Lila finished the thought for her. Other times, it isn't. Eva glanced between them, sensing the unspoken weight passing between the two women. It's not just Reynolds, Eva said, her voice soft but firm. I've seen it before, and I'll see it again. Lila's eyes didn't leave Harper's face. But not from you, Lila said carefully. Harper held her gaze. Not from me. By noon, the hospital had returned to its usual rhythm. Patients filtered in and out. Staff moved briskly from one room to the next. And the hum of everyday life resumed its familiar pace. But something was different. Lila sat by the window now, wrapped in a thin hospital blanket, watching the rain that had begun to fall in steady sheets. Eva stood beside her, arms crossed loosely over her chest. I'll be discharged tomorrow, Lila said. Eva nodded. You think Reynolds will even notice I'm gone? Lila asked, a faint smile curling at the edge of her lips. Eva smirked. Doubt it. There was no bitterness in the exchange. Only the shared understanding of two women who had spent their lives threading the needle between doubt and certainty. Later that afternoon, as Lila rested, Dr. Harper met Reynolds near the elevator. He was slipping into his coat, ready to leave for the day. His face was impassive, the weight of the previous night seemingly forgotten. Harper stepped into his path, stopping him with a glance. David, Harper began, her voice even. We need to talk. Reynolds sighed, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve. If this is about Ms. Freeman, it's not just about her. Harper interrupted, her tone firm but quiet. It's about all the others you didn't see. Reynolds hesitated, his mouth opening to respond. But something in Harper's gaze held him still. You know what the difference was between Lila Freeman and the man you sent to cardiology last week? Harper asked, her voice calm. Reynolds said nothing. Harper stepped closer, her words deliberate. She wasn't loud enough for you to hear. But she shouldn't have needed to be. Reynolds glanced down, unable to meet her eyes. I'll handle the paperwork, Harper added, brushing past him without waiting for an answer. That evening, as Eva prepared to leave for the night, she paused by Lila's door. Lila turned toward her, one brow raised. You sticking around forever? Lila teased gently. Eva smiled. No, but I'll be back tomorrow. Lila's expression softened. Thank you, Lila said, for staying, for listening. Eva's hand rested lightly on the doorframe. Sometimes, Eva replied. Listening is all we've got. Lila nodded once. And as the door closed behind Eva, the quiet of the hospital settled around Lila like a familiar blanket, still heavy, but no longer unbearable. Lila Freeman left the hospital the next afternoon, her heart steady but her mind far from still. The storm that had passed through the city left the streets washed clean. But she could feel the weight of something unfinished pressing down like the thick summer air after rain. Eva Ramirez met her by the exit, holding a small folder of discharge papers. You'll need to follow up in a week, Eva said, offering a polite smile. But her eyes held something else, something unspoken that had nothing to do with checkups or prescriptions. Lila took the papers and nodded. I will. They stood there for a moment. Two women bound not by friendship, but by the thin thread of shared knowing. Reynolds isn't here today, Eva said, almost casually. I figured, Lila replied. Eva shifted, tucking the clipboard under her arm. Dr. Harper filed a report. Lila's eyebrows lifted slightly. It won't do much, Eva added with a soft exhale. Men like him have a way of outlasting things that should have buried them. Lila's gaze drifted toward the glass doors leading outside. The world beyond them felt larger somehow. Like she was re-entering a space that hadn't changed but expected her to. They outlast things because people let them, Lila said, folding the papers neatly. That's the part no one wants to say out loud. Eva's lips pressed into a thin line. But she didn't deny it. Lila stepped out into the afternoon sunlight. The warmth of it unexpected against her skin. She had planned to go straight home. To slip back into the comfortable routine of emails and meetings that would inevitably swallow this experience whole. But her feet carried her somewhere else. It wasn't until she stood outside the glass-paneled office marked Philip Kent, hospital administrator, that she realized why she had come. Philip Kent had been the hospital's administrator for nearly 20 years. He wasn't the kind of man who raised his voice or drew attention. But Lila had learned long ago that power rarely announced itself. It sat quietly behind desks and sent others to do the speaking. Lila knocked once before stepping inside. Kent's office smelled faintly of leather and paper. The kind of sterile masculinity that always accompanied spaces like this. He looked up from his desk, clearly surprised by her presence. Ms. Freeman, he said, rising politely. I wasn't expecting you. Lila smiled. But it was the kind of smile that carried weight behind it. I thought I'd stop by, she replied, stepping forward. Kent gestured to the chair across from his desk. Please, sit. Lila didn't. Instead, she placed the discharge papers carefully on his desk and met his eyes. I imagine you've heard by now. Lila began, her voice even, about what happened in room 7. Kent's expression shifted, though he masked it well. I did, he said, settling back into his chair. Dr. Harper mentioned there was an oversight. Lila let the word hang in the air, twisting slightly as it landed. Oversight, Lila repeated softly. That's an interesting word. Kent adjusted his cufflinks, a nervous habit that Lila recognized immediately. I assure you, Ms. Freeman, we take these matters seriously. Dr. Reynolds is. Lila cut him off with a quiet sharpness. This isn't about Dr. Reynolds. Kent blinked. I'm not sure I follow. Lila stepped closer to the desk, her hands resting lightly on its edge. This isn't about one doctor, she said, her voice calm but unrelenting. It's about a system that allows him to walk out of that room without a second thought. It's about the reports that get filed and buried. The patients who go home because no one wants to believe that the pain they feel is real. Kent shifted in his seat, his polite facade beginning to fray at the edges. Ms. Freeman, I understand your frustration, but… No, Lila interrupted, her gaze unwavering. You understand the risk I represent. The difference between me and the patients you don't hear about is that I survived long enough to stand in this office. Kent's mouth opened, but no words came. Lila leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough to fill the space between them. I know what happens next, she said. You'll hold a meeting. Policies will be revised. And 6 months from now, Reynolds will still be here, making the same decisions for patients who don't have the time to wait for your process to catch up. Kent's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. Lila straightened, smoothing her coat as she prepared to leave. You can decide what to do with Reynolds, she added, pausing at the door. But make no mistake, Mr. Kent, if I hear that this happens again, it won't be your office I visit. It'll be the boardroom. Kent's eyes followed her, but he said nothing as she stepped into the hallway, the door clicking softly shut behind her. By the time Lila reached the exit, the rain had stopped, leaving the sidewalks glistening beneath the fading sun. Eva Ramirez stood by the reception desk, watching as Lila approached. You really think he'll do anything? Eva asked, glancing toward Kent's office. Lila adjusted the strap of her bag, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Maybe not today, Lila replied, but people like Kent, people like Reynolds, they count on silence. And I've decided I'm not giving them that anymore. Eva met her gaze, a quiet respect passing between them. "Neither am I," Eva said softly. Lila stepped outside, the warmth of the setting sun stretching long shadows across the pavement. And for the first time in a long while, the weight she carried felt just a little lighter.